Hi everyone, I'm the Limitless Librarian and today I'm going to be talking to you about reading kids' books as an adult. This has been a bit of a theme on my channel lately, with both of my reviews so far this month being of kids' books and with half of my top 10 reads of March being a series of kids' books. And that trend is going to be continuing next week with my review of the Trials of Apollo series. And some of you might be wondering, kind of understandably, what is a 24-year-old doing reading books aimed at those half her age or younger? Is it because they're easy? Don't you want to challenge yourself? Well, if you look at my channel history, I've also read some very challenging books, including the 1300-page monster 1Q84 by Murakami, which is absolutely not for kids. If you read it, you know that. But the point of this video isn't to defend my reading choices. It's to enlighten you as to some of the benefits that I and others have found reading kids' books as an adult, why you may have been sleeping on them and how you could benefit from them and why they are still meaningful for adults to read. I have 12 reasons to get through today, so a lot to discuss in no particular order. So, without further ado, this is 12 reasons why kids' books can still be meaningful to read as an adult. Reason number 1 is perhaps one of the most important reasons, and that is that these books will help you empathize with kids. Growing up, I felt that a lot of the people around me often seem to have almost forgotten that they were once whatever age that I was, especially given that I was the youngest of 2 siblings and thus the baby of the family, even when I was objectively no longer a baby. So growing up, I often felt judged for interests or hobbies like, pretend games, for example, that were actually perfectly normal for the age that I was at that time. I was belittled and even mocked for it. And this has, believe it or not, had lasting impacts on me. It just took a long time to realize that. Now, I will be the first to admit I do not want kids, and nor do I want to be in a job where I have to be around kids a lot. That's just not an interest for me. But I think it's important to remember that I was a kid once. And I really do not want to lose sight of that fact or forget what that was like. Because the things that seem trivial or cringy or inconsequential to us now seem so much bigger to kids. And that's not really their fault, and that's not your fault, but more importantly, as I said, it's not their fault. Additionally, there can be real consequences when adults don't listen to the kids because, quote unquote, they're just kids. Furthermore, we often dismiss the concerns of children because, having grown up, we know better, or at least we think we do. We know there are bigger, scarier problems out there than whatever your kid is dealing with right now. But that doesn't lessen the impact of these problems or anxieties in the mind of those children. So that's why I think that it's important for adults to be continuously reminded that we were all once kids. King Charles was a kid once. Your favourite or least favourite politician of the day was a kid once. Donald Trump was a kid once. Taylor Swift was a kid once. Ted Bundy and Jack the Ripper were kids once. Your parents were kids once. And most importantly, you were a kid once. And I think it's very important that we don't forget that. Because as soon as we adults forget or lose sight of the fact that we were once like that, then we lose our ability to listen to kids, to be receptive of their problems, to realize when they're telling us something important, like if they're in danger, for example. And we also lose our ability to empathize with the struggles that they are currently dealing with that we didn't, and that they will deal with, that future generations will deal with as a consequence of what the current and past generations have made of the world. Reason number 2, in a similar vein but subtly different, is that kids' books allow us to see adult situations from the perspective of a child. We see how children interpret these situations, how they react to the situations, how they view the situations, especially with the more limited knowledge and understanding they may have of them. And sometimes that can be really sobering, because we adults, we may often justify our actions by one reason or another, but the kids involved or who are exposed to those situations don't have that often selfish adult justification for his actions or the situation. One example of this is war, and so I'd like to point you to this particular book, Rabbit, Soldier, Angel, Thief by Katrina Nanastad. This is a book that focused on a 6-year-old boy in World War II Russia whose parents get killed, and he ends up being essentially adopted by the Russian army. And he is involved in a lot of very dangerous situations, and he also sees his loved ones in the Russian army get hurt or even killed. He has to deal with the worry of, will they come home, won't they? He also has to grapple with moral dilemmas when they come across a German village that has surrendered, and some of the army people are taking advantage of the situation by going into the homes of the surrendered villagers, their families, and just taking whatever they want from their homes, because the Russians are the good guys, the Germans are the bad guys, even though these are in fact civilians who did not endorse any of the things that the German military were doing. They had no part in the war, they were just in the way. And so our protagonist, Sasha, is also tempted to do this, seeing his adult friends and family essentially doing this practice. And so he intimidates a young German boy into giving up his favorite expensive toy to Sasha. And then he has to grapple with the soldiers, seeing what kind of an influence that had on Sasha, what lesson that taught him. And, whether that's the kind of person that he wants to be. So it's sobering for the soldiers to see that kind of influence that they had on this child, what kind of a message and a lesson that was teaching. The soldiers justified their actions because they believed they deserved this property, because they were the good guys, they'd helped to end the war or drive the German soldiers out. And so they believed that they were entitled to the villagers' belongings, especially since the villagers, through no fault of their own, were citizens of the bad guys' country. It was only when they saw Sasha taking up this same practice but without any of that justification that the soldiers realized the error of their ways. Another example of a very difficult and adult sort of concept seen through the eyes of a child is in Jacqueline Wilson's Tracy Beaker's trilogy. This centers on a girl, Tracy Beaker, who lives in the foster system, which is notoriously problematic no matter where you go, with kids having to be shuffled between different foster parents, having to gather all their belongings in literally bin bags to carry along with them, which is dehumanizing. Not having a stable environment, having to live in a shared home with all these other random kids, and just the kind of emotions that this brings up. Even one situation where she ended up with a good foster family but was then essentially replaced when they had their own biological child, and how she felt so betrayed by that and was thus very mistrustful or, skeptical or cynical about any future foster family she ended up with. And it caused her to act out and be a quote-unquote problem child in the eyes of all those adults, because she just didn't trust that anything would last. So I think it's important to shine light on issues like this, because this shows why quote-unquote problem children can end up like that, and that it's not really the children themselves that are the problem. The last example of this that I'd like to show you is a book that legitimately made me cry. And that's a rare feat. And that is Hello God by Moya Simons. And I'm going to spoil this one a bit for you. This book is about a young girl named Kate. I think she's about 8 years old. And every night she decides to talk to God before she goes to bed to tell him about her day and what happens. It's not really a religious story, but that's the premise of the book. That's why it's called that. And Kate eventually makes friends with this other girl named Stephanie. And one day Stephanie does not show up at school. And Kate doesn't think much of that. But then eventually Kate goes over to Stephanie's house and she notices all these bruises on Stephanie's legs. And she's like, what's that? Are you okay? And Stephanie's like, oh yeah, that just happens. Those show up. That's normal. Well, it turns out Stephanie has cancer. And so we see Kate grappling with that and worrying about whether or not Stephanie will make it as her condition deteriorates. And especially through her very raw, very heartfelt pleas to God to, if you're there, please save Stephanie. Why are you doing this? Why would you let this poor innocent girl who is my best friend go through this? And so we see this situation through this child's eyes because obviously she does not know, like she knows Stephanie is really sick and she's in hospital, but she doesn't know what exactly cancer is or what grueling treatment Stephanie must be enduring. So it's made all the more powerful by the child's innocence and lack of knowledge that only comes with, being an adult and gaining experience and knowledge of these kinds of situations. So I think it's important for adults to be able to get this child's perspective on these situations, because it's not always easy for us to remember how we felt when we were a kid, learning about situations or experiencing them, or imagining how our child selves would have felt about a situation like that, even if we had to experience it. And especially in situations like, for example, Tracy Beaker, seeing the child's perspective can help us to understand the real psychology involved in what might otherwise be seen as problem or delinquent children, for example, and understand why they turn out that way, and that really the children aren't actually the problem. It's the system and the adults who created that problematic system that are the problem and need to change. Reason number 3, continue on this bit of a Debbie Downer trend, is that, quite frankly, the world sucks. And kids' books can provide a nice, light-hearted escape from that for a bit. Whether it's something that is funny and silly like an Andy Griffiths book, or something that feels like a warm hug like Paddington Bear. Sometimes we just need that comfort or to have a laugh when this world gets a bit too much, and that's perfectly valid and understandable. And it's not always easy to find in more grown-up books, because those grown-up books with their grown-up protagonists are going to focus more on the problems of the world and adult problems, which we want to forget about or leave behind for a bit. In a similar vein, sometimes reading a kid's book can help to heal your inner child. This is a phrase that I've seen a lot in reference, in fact, to the TV show Bluey, which is an absolute masterpiece. I love it. I know a lot of adults love it, as well as kids. If you don't know what Bluey is, you've been living under a rock for the last few years, I'm afraid. It's an Australian children's TV show about a family of anthropomorphic dogs and things that they get up to, playing games and experiencing different things, including certain sensitive topics like infertility, moving house. There's even a divorce featured episode, all sorts of different things. And I've heard a lot of people say that Bluey helps to heal their inner child because Bluey's parents are loving and attentive and the kind of parents that they wish that they'd had. And so it feels like you're finally getting the chance to have the loving childhood that you missed out on. living vicariously through Bluey and her sister Bingo. And so a lot of children's books can also provide the same sort of experience. For example, again, Paddington Bear has a similar sort of thing where he ends up with this family called the Browns and they give him lots of new experiences. Reason number 5 is that kids' books can help get you out of a reading slump. I've often been in a reading slump, and just getting into a kid's book, which is quick and easy to read, will help me get out of it, get some momentum going, and kick me out of that reading slump. So if you're just stuck with a really challenging book, or you're not even sure why you're struggling with a book, it's okay to put it down for a bit and pick up something that's a bit easier that might give you a bit more of that momentum to get you back reading again. Reason number 6 relates to kids' books that you actually read as a kid. Although you don't necessarily have to have read them as a kid, but reading them as a kid or as an adult can give you a wholly different experience. Again, it's that perspective thing. But in some cases, it's actually really interesting to examine these books from an adult perspective. The poster child for this is the Diary of a Wimpy Kid series by Jeff Kinney, which I should point out has a pretty active adult fandom on YouTube analysing the books, and more specifically the characters in those books, and whether they have certain personality disorders, mental health things, whether protagonist Greg Heffley's parents are good parents, what on earth is going on with Manny. Really interesting psychoanalysis on these books. Because as a kid, you can kind of sympathize with Greg's kind of attitude, you know. He's fed up with his school and his family and just everything. But when you're reading this as an adult, you realize he's actually selfish and manipulative, especially to his best friend Rowley, who is just innocent and basically is kind of acts young for his age, who's just innocent. And so it's actually really interesting to see Greg through this perspective, seeing how problematic his behavior is, but also seeing those rare moments where you actually do think he's in the right. That's kind of interesting to see, given how problematic he appears reading him as an adult. There's also a companion book to this which really proves this point, that is actually written from Rowley Jefferson's perspective, called Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid. And so that gives Rowley's perspective on Greg's behavior. And so without Greg's biased perspective on his own actions, you can actually see some of the really dark, messed up stuff that he does. Further exacerbating how messed up it is, just how ignorant Rowley is to it all. Reason number 7 is that kids' books can be a gateway to learning about new things, including things that you might not have realized you would be interested in. One very common example is the Percy Jackson and the Olympians series, which got a lot of adults into Greek mythology. I read them as a kid, and that was what got me into Greek mythology, but it also helped to get a lot of adults into it who are reading them for the first time as an adult. In a similar vein, last year or the year before, I read this book, Strange Irish Tales for Children, because I didn't really know much about Celtic mythology and I wanted to learn a bit more about it. And so this book features 4 stories about the Irish folk hero Finn McCool and his clan, the Finner. And so that was a soft introduction to Celtic mythology and some of the things that are in it, compared to reading some actual classical sources. So having a bit of a foot in the door in that respect, or a soft introduction, can help ease the barrier to entry for a lot of these sort of interests. Another example that might be relevant to some people is, for example, Horrible Histories, which are a series of non-fiction history books aimed at kids. And there is, of course, the Horrible Histories TV show. And so I have no doubt that these books have probably gotten a lot of people interested in certain historical periods that they wouldn't have really had much interest in before. So if there's something that you might be interested in learning more about, but you're kind of scared of the barrier to entry, or the knowledge gap or whatever, maybe try and find a kid's book about it. Whether it's a fictional story that has that thing as a plot element or a kid's non-fiction book about it. In fact, a lot of kids' books that talk about real events or mythology or things like that might have a section in the back that gives you some more information about that, or even sources for where to find out more. Reason number 8 is for the aspiring multilinguals out there, and that is that kids' books can be a great tool for learning new languages. This doesn't apply to me, but I've heard a lot of people on YouTube, or BookTube specifically, pick up books in different languages that they have read in their primary language to help them practice their fluency by trying to read them. The idea is that it's a story that you're already familiar with, so you sort of know what to expect in terms of what words to expect, what the setting is going to be like. But it's still going to be a real accomplishment to read that book and understand it fully in another language. And kids' books can help with that because they're obviously generally a lot easier than adult books. Plus, a lot of them include illustrations that can also help you figure out what's going on if you get a bit stuck. So, if you're learning another language and you're just starting to get a bit fluent with reading some more complex sentences, maybe find a favorite childhood book and then buy that same book in the language you're learning. On the topic of illustrations, that's my next reason. I'm no artist myself, but I can definitely appreciate some great illustrations in a book. And there are definitely going to be readers out there who will love the illustrations in a book even if they don't necessarily enjoy the story. In my March reading wrap-up, the top 5 spots were taken up by this new series that I discovered called Worst Week Ever by Eva Amores. And I absolutely love this series, and one of the reasons why is the illustrations. They are so fun and so detailed. Like, look at this one, where the bully character is recording the main character on his phone, and even the image on the phone is really detailed. I really like the details and the style of these illustrations in this book, and it made this whole series a real treat in every way. And there are definitely other examples I can think of. The house with a clock in its walls, I remember really liking the style of the illustrations in that book. So yeah, if you're into art or pictures, maybe take a look at some illustrations in kids' books. You might appreciate them, even if you find the story itself to be kind of simplistic or not your cup of tea. Point number 10 is to share these stories with the next generation. If you have kids yourself, and of course being a reader watching this channel, you probably want to get them into reading too. They're probably going to get more into it if you yourself are interested in the stories that you're encouraging them to read. And you're going to be able to have more meaningful conversations about those stories with your children if you've had a chance to read them on your own yourself. Even if you, like me, don't have kids, I believe that passing great stories on to the next generation is important. As much as there are still plenty of great new kids' books coming out every day, all those old ones can also inform the kids of today about what it was like back then, or even just help to preserve these great stories to ensure that they're not forgotten. So I believe there is value in adults experiencing children's stories so that we can recommend them to future generations and ensure that they are preserved and continue to be talked about. Reason number 11 to read kids' books as an adult is to catch up on any childhood favourites that you may have left incomplete. Are there any series that you really loved as a child but you never found out how the story ended because for whatever reason you stopped reading them? Maybe you're kind of curious about how that ended. Well, why not catch up? You might as well if it's bothering you. Or, even go online and find some fan fiction. There are heaps of people writing, for example, grown-up future stories about kids' characters like Diary of a Wimpy Kid or Bluey. imagining what happens to the characters when they grow up. So I think it can be kind of fun, and if nothing else, it will give you closure on your childhood favourites. Who knows, revisiting your old favourites may even help you discover some cool new content that might have been produced, whether that's a movie or a TV show that might be based on those books. For example, Paddington Bear has 3 TV shows that I know about, plus the 2 movies. There's no shame in wanting to revisit a childhood favourite series to find out how it ends, because you never got to find out as a kid. I mean, nobody likes an incomplete story without an ending, right? And my last point is that at the end of the day, any reading is better than none at all. Not everyone is as prolific a reader as me and the rest of BookTube. Some people struggle with reading, some people find it intimidating, or some people are wanting to cultivate a love for reading but still feel intimidated by the average adult novel. And so I will remind you that kids' books are still books. Graphic novels and manga are still books. Audiobooks are still books. Read whatever you can and whatever you want to. If that's the gateway you need to get you into reading, then that's great. As I said in my point about reading slumps, kids' books being easy can give you a boost of momentum, which can be all you need to get you out of a reading slump or to get you to fall in love with reading. Especially if you found reading really scary growing up. For example, if you were dyslexic or just struggled with it for whatever reason, there's no better time to start than now. And thus concludes my 12 reasons why adults can still find kids' books valuable and meaningful. Let me know what your favourite kids' books are in the comments, especially as an adult, and also if you have any other points to add to this discussion. I think this is a really interesting discussion to have. If you liked the video and you'd like to see more discussions like this, please like and subscribe to the channel. I'll also pop a playlist in the description for more of my discussion videos. For example, I did a really great one last month about feminist fiction. And as always, do lots of maths, read lots of books, and I'm sure you'll have an amazing day.